I'm going to introduce you to some of the curious characters, places, and scary monsters that I've encountered over the many decades that I've been exploring Portland in Dorset. For example, Hiram Otter, a deeply religious man who single-handedly changed the face of Portland. Birth control promoter, Dr. Mari Stopes, as you've never seen her before. Derelict buildings locked away behind high security fences. A toilet seat that may have had an influence on the outcome of World War II, and many more curiosities. But before we start, I must warn all Portland-born viewers that the next slide may offend, so look away now. Portlanders' famous animosity towards rabbits, there I've said the forbidden word, is a tradition of unknown origin. It seems that saying the creature's name is believed to bring bad luck, despite the creatures themselves having been bred in warrens and eaten for centuries. Portlanders have a large repertoire of alternative names, such as They They're Furry Things, Conies, Underground Mutton, 2x4s and Wilfrids. Wilfrids? Those of you belonging to a mature generation may remember a Daily Mirror cartoon series, which was published from 1919 until 1956, which featured Pip, Squeak and Wilfrid. This was an adventurous family comprising a dog, Pip, as the father, a penguin, Squeak, as the mother, and a furry thing, Wilfrid, as the child. I don't know how that would have worked, but genetics was in its infancy in those days. This aversion of Portlanders was thrust into the national consciousness when the film Wallace and Gromit and the Curse of the Weir Furry Thing was launched. In deference to Portlanders' sensitivities, a special version of the poster was produced to display on local bus shelters. A reporter, I believe from the Sun newspaper, thought it would be a funny stunt to hop around Euston Square dressed as a furry thing, provoking a response from the residents. Now, I'm not suggesting that there was any connection with this show of foolish bravado, but a few days later, the warehouse containing the entire collection of Wallace and Gromit puppets, film sets, and other treasures such as Morph were destroyed in a catastrophic fire. Coincidence or what? Obviously, somebody on the local council showed a wicked sense of provocative humour when this ride was recently erected in Euston Children's Playground. I'm going to move on now to describe some of Portland's very curious characters. The Upper Lighthouse stands on the hill up from its more modern counterpart at Portland Bill. Built in 1716, it was originally lit by a coal fire. However, it was so difficult to transport coal from Castletown to Portland Bill by horse and cart, especially in the winter, that the fire was frequently unlit through lack of coal. The remedy was to fit an oil-fired light. This was the first lighthouse in the country to be lit in this way. When the lighthouse that we are now familiar with at Portland Bill was built in 1905, the upper lighthouse was redundant and was sold off. From the 1920s, it was occupied by Dr. Mari Stopes, who became internationally famous for her promotion of birth control education. She was a paleobotanist, someone who studies fossilized plants, and was the first female academic employed at Manchester University. On a research trip to Germany, she had a liaison with a Japanese academic and had also been romantically associated with female admirers, so her sexuality was somewhat confused but intense. At the age of 31, which in those days would have marked her out as heading to be an old maid, she married. This was a disaster, and she very soon realised what was missing from her marriage: sex. She then had two burning crusades. One was to divorce her impotent husband on the grounds of non-consummation of the marriage. A century ago, it was very difficult for a woman to get a divorce. This was usually achieved with the husband's cooperation for reasons that benefited him. Mary Stopes's husband certainly was unhappy with being accused of being impotent. In his defence, he stated that his wife was oversexed to a degree that was almost pathological. I could have satisfied the desires of any normal woman. Mary Stopes tenaciously fought for her divorce despite the overt aggression by elderly male judges, and she won. Her second great mission was to research all she could about sex and birth control, and to publish this as a book. She was 36 years old and still a virgin. No publisher would touch her book, which was unlike anything available at the time. It contained explicit advice on the mutual enjoyment of sex and advice on birth control. Mary Stopes was introduced to Humphrey Verdon Roe, a wealthy founder of the Saunders Roe Aircraft Company. He was enthusiastic about her book and paid for it to be published privately. It was an immediate success, and 5 editions were published in the first year. Mary and Humphrey fell in love and eventually married, he being 39 years old and Mary 38. Her fame brought many famous visitors to her Portland Lighthouse home. Here, for example, we see Thomas Hardy and his wife Emma on the left. Other visitors included H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw. Here we see Mary with her son, evidence of the success of her second marriage. She was 42 years old when Henry Stopes Roe was born. Mary Stopes could be provocative and outrageous, which made her unpopular with the prim Methodist Portlanders. For example, she would tell locals that her son was conceived in the lantern house on top of the lighthouse. I'm guessing that the light wasn't lit at the time. Her books were heavily opposed by the churches, especially by the Catholic Church, which took legal action to have copies destroyed. As late as 1931, a married couple were arrested in Ireland for possessing a copy of one of Mary Stopes' books. Mary Stopes had a dark side. She was an enthusiastic promoter of eugenics, the forcible prevention of breeding by those deemed unfit to do so due to moral, physical, or mental weakness. Her son Henry grew up and fell in love. He planned to marry the daughter of Dr. Barnes Wallace, the inventor of the dam-busting bouncing bomb. Mary Stopes was horrified and disinherited her son because the lady was short-sighted and wore glasses. She didn't want this physical deformity tainting her lineage. When Mary Stopes died in 1958, all her son inherited was a dictionary. She greatly admired Hitler's ethnic cleansing policies and sent him a signed book of love poems. This cartoon mocks the eugenics movement. A haughty lady is refusing to agree to marry her lover unless he can produce a certificate of eugenic purity in body, mind, and religion. I've mentioned that Portlanders were strongly prim and proper Methodists, having been greatly influenced by John Wesley preaching on the island. Here we see members of the Zion Chapel in 1900, indicated as Hiram Otter. Hiram spent his days touring Portland and spontaneously preaching wherever he could find a spot to place his soapbox. Here we see him in his Salvation Army sweater, carrying his umbrella decorated with biblical quotations. He must have been a fine sight, preaching whilst waving his opened umbrella to inspire his audience. When not preaching, he spent his time building by hand a footpath in the area shown on this map. This took many years to complete and partially survives to this day. As he finished each day's work, he would shout, "Hallelujah!" And this area is still known on maps today as Hallelujah Bay. Hiram carved biblical texts on rocks, and I've searched for decades to find a surviving carving. This is the closest I've achieved. The faded remains of Hiram's carving or just random graffiti. Another Portland character was nicknamed Jack Knapp. His hobby was knapping flintstones in the manner of Mesolithic folk and scattering his handiwork over ancient Portland sites, much to the confusion and annoyance of local archaeologists. Jack was the first to achieve the distinction of getting banned from every pub on Portland for his drunken behaviour. A century ago, there were many, many more pubs on Portland than now, so this was a hard-won achievement. His faithful companions were Jim, his dog, and Joe, his pet goose. If a landlord tried to eject a drunken Jack, the dog and the goose would go on the attack, causing many a wounded leg. Sadly, his faithful pet goose disappeared just before one Christmas. The theft was never resolved, but Joe was probably goose-napped and appeared on some Portlander's Christmas dinner table. Dodger Cutting was proud of his cow, but the local health inspector decided that Dodger was not looking after his animal properly. He was told to improve the cow's living quarters or the animal would be taken away. So Dodger put a carpet down on the barn floor, hung pictures on the wall, and installed a harmonium to entertain his cow in the evening. When the health inspector next visited, he went away scratching his head. He'd never seen anything like Dodger's manger. Dickie Hoskins had a nice little business going on Portland. For a fee, he would take unwanted animals and pets away to put them down humanely to sleep and bury them in his pet cemetery. But it wasn't that simple. Dickie was actually taking the animals to Weymouth and selling them to unsuspecting mainlanders. The cemetery was a fake. Dickie's pet cemetery was supposed to be on the right of this picture, showing the top of Old Hill, but it never existed. Mind you, when you walk past this stop, there's always a strange smell. Could there really be a mass grave of dead pets buried here? Dap and General were brothers, born in Kent in the middle of the 19th century, who moved to Portland when young and lived in Portland and died in the 1920s. Dap is on the right in this picture. They've been depicted as the Laurel and Hardy of the royal manor, and very many stories have been recorded of their escapades, probably most of them made up. One story tells how Dap and General went to London for the day on the train, their first trip off Portland. On returning home, they told their friends how wonderful London was. It was all covered over with a huge glass roof to keep the rain out. It was eventually discovered that they'd stayed in Waterloo Station all day, believing that that was all there was of London. This may not be so unbelievable when it's recalled that even in the 1970s there were Portlanders who had never in all their lives been off the island, even to Weymouth. Another story tells how the brothers found a huge wooden beam on Chesil Beach. They struggled to carry it between them, but it was too heavy. Dap went home and eventually appeared with a saw. He cut the beam into two halves, and the brothers each carried half of the beam home. "Why, that was so much easier," declared Dap. It seems that Dap was a great admirer of Dr. Howard, who rode an old motorbike to get around Portland and wore a reversed cap. Dap thought this looked wonderful, so he went to a gents outfitter in Fortuneswell for such a cap. Having tried on everything in the shop without success, the frustrated shopkeeper asked Dap what sort of cap he wanted. "I want none of these. I want one like the doctor's, with the peak at the back." Nicodemus Knob is an isolated pillar of rock to the north of the Youth Offenders Institution. Over 6 million tons of stone were excavated from this area to build Portland breakwater. This pillar may have been left to show later generations where the original surface was and how this area, equal to a dozen football pitches, had been so deeply quarried. Around 1990, I had published in the Free Portland newspaper an entirely fictitious story of the reason this high rock pillar, Nicodemus Knob, was left by the quarryman. It went like this. Nicodemus was an Irish Protestant who fled the Emerald Isle in the turbulent decades following the Battle of the Boyne, and he settled in Buckland Ripers, a hamlet north of Weymouth. However, finding the pace of life there too hectic, he moved to Portland in about 1735. Unfortunately, Nicholas was one of the few, other than Weymouth men of whom no better were expected, who took advantage of the local Portland courting practices. For by 1745 he had 3 fiancées pregnant at the same time. Since they lived in Chiswell, Weston and Southwell, there was no way they would ever meet. Poor Nick was driven to distraction by the commuting between Underhill and Top Hill. Eventually the court leet got wind of what was going on and took appropriate action. Stories and jokes about Nick abounded in the 18th and 19th centuries, and he became a cult figure. But because of the crudity of the stories that sprung up after his death, these were never written down or told in polite society. They were passed around the quarries and the alehouses, just as the stories of Dappan General have proliferated. When the land was quarried to build the Portland Breakwater, a solitary pillar of rock was left by quarrymen as an appropriate monument to the legendary prowess of Nicodemus. Although obviously a joke, this invention of mine was published widely nationally and is still, over 3 decades later, widely touted as the true origin of Nicodemus's knob. Portlanders have often been regarded as rather eccentric and backwards in their traditions, but they were ahead of their time in many important ways. For example, on a person's death, their estate was shared equally between male and female children, centuries before this was commonplace in the rest of Britain. This picture from 1902 shows a strange football team comprising men and women accompanied by 2 clowns. I'm delighted with the upsurge in interest in recent years in women's football, but this picture shows that equality of the sexes and women playing football was the norm over a century ago on Portland. I could relate many more stories about Portland's curious characters, but now I'm going to move on and look at curious places. A short distance south of the Verne Prison is the High Angle Battery. This was built in the early 1890s as part of the defensive gun batteries protecting Portland Naval Base from attack. The threat in late Victorian times was from French warships, which were heavily protected by iron armour on their hulls. The guns in the High Angle Battery were designed to fire shells high into the air so that they hit the relatively unprotected decks of the warships to explode inside the ships. The guns supplied for this battery were obsolete when installed and were never used in anger. The guns were removed after scarcely a decade, and over the next century, the decaying buildings have provided a playground for children. Known locally as the ghost tunnels, they are a spooky place to explore. Here we see one of the guns in place in around 1900. A game I played with my young grandchildren was to give them this photograph and send them off to find the spot where the picture was taken. Success! Here we see that 2 of my grandchildren have found the location. Note how the steps and the hatches match between the 2 pictures. These underground buildings were where the ammunition was stored. The shells were trundled out on trolleys running on the rails, which are still in place. Although the entrances have been closed by steel gates, these are frequently vandalised. Portlanders traditionally don't like gates and fences. This means that the tunnels can often be entered carefully with a bright, reliable torch by anybody not scared of the ghosts that may live there. Children love exploring these tunnels. I've said that the guns were obsolete when installed. This was because they were muzzle loaders. This means that the propellant, wadding and heavy shells had to be lifted with a small crane attached to the front of the gun and slid down the muzzle. The guns were then laboriously turned and fired. The reloading time was ridiculously slow. This small building was the toilet used by the soldiers who were manning the guns. Sadly, after 100 years, it's no longer in operation and available to visitors. There are several other Victorian gun batteries. All but one of these are within the secure area owned by Portland Port. The one on public land is heavily overgrown and hidden in this picture. What looks like a stone seat on the right is the ventilator on the roof of a building where ammunition would have been stored in the 19th century. Within the white outline lies the main building of this well-hidden gun battery. With difficulty, it's possible to get into the buildings, a visit requiring secateurs, bramble-proof clothing, endurance, and a mobile phone to call for rescue. I have successfully managed to get into this site, as shown by this picture from 1989, which shows the main building that housed the Victorian gun crews. In more recent times, the gun battery was adopted by a local gang who left evidence of their presence by graffiti and the remains of alcohol-fueled parties. Venturing into the main building with a powerful torch, I once found these bottles and cans piled up inside the building. Another well-kept secret lies under Fancy's Farm on the east coast of Portland. In the 1950s, a huge excavation was constructed and filled with equipment. This massive project was conducted in great secrecy, and even the local workmen employed on this task had no idea what the purpose was. Rumours were rife that it was a bunker where the royal family would live in the event of a nuclear war. Some thought it was a secret base from where the government would communicate with aliens visiting in flying saucers. In fact, it was a vast underground radar station named RAF Portland. This is where all the radar equipment was operated, deep underground. From the main underground communications building, long tunnels stretched out under Portland. The depth underground can be judged by the height of this access ladder. Recently, I struggled along an overgrown footpath on the east side of Portland beneath the ramparts of the Verne Prison. After about half a mile, I was able, with much difficulty, to climb over a steep earth bank which dropped down into the deep ditch surrounding the prison. There I discovered this heavy concrete slab which protected a ventilator connected to one of the long tunnels stretching out deep from under Fancy's Farm to go under the Verne Prison. This slab was designed to protect the underground radar technicians from a nearby nuclear bomb detonation. There is another secret tunnel built during World War II from what was then the Royal Navy base into the solid rock of Portland beneath the Verne Prison. This was a communications centre deep under Portland in the months leading up to the D-Day expedition. Visitors to this tunnel almost certainly included Winston Churchill, General Eisenhower, and King George VI, all of whom visited Portland around this time. It is entirely probable that the toilet shown here was sat upon by one or all of those illustrious men. If the toilet seat has survived, shouldn't it be removed to a pride of place in Portland Museum? Within the secure area previously part of the Royal Naval Dockyard and now owned by Portland Port, there lies a ravaged and spooky landscape known locally as the Forbidden City. Scattered around this area are Victorian gun batteries, along with abandoned and decaying buildings from World War II. Despite the heavy security on this site, adventurous, so-called urban explorers, have visited these buildings and taken photographs. This site was much used when in Royal Navy hands for training British and foreign navies. The buildings were used for practicing urban guerrilla fighting as well as DISTEX, disaster humanitarian exercises. Some of the sailors left their mark on the old buildings, such as this graffiti left by German sailors in 1987. Less artistically pleasing graffiti was left by sailors from HMS Norfolk. Even a cast iron cooker from World War II still stands forlornly in a derelict building. I have to stress that I do not condone trespassing on Portland Port property, and security has been greatly increased since these pictures were taken over 20 years ago. Another underground project from World War II was Portland's Underground Hospital. Located on the right of the road leading to the main NHS hospital buildings, it was built in World War II as a secure place to conduct operations. Because the hospital was so close to the Royal Naval Dockyard, it was in great danger of being bombed. This shows the small underground hospital under its protective mound of earth. Not much is now left in the hospital, and it has been securely locked for decades. If you stand on the cliff top around the back of the Youth Offenders Institute, known to locals as the Old Borstal, there is little to see in a landscape covered by brambles. Look carefully and you will make out rectangular concrete structures. Going back to mid-Victorian days, this was the site of a waterworks. This supplied water to the dockyard and to Portland Prison. Civilians traditionally were supplied by wells, hence the names scattered around Portland, such as Chiswell, Fortune's Well, Maidenwell, Southwell, Culverwell, etc. However, there was a great influx of workers and their families in the 19th century due to the development of the naval dockyard, the army in the Verne Citadel and Portland's prison. The greatly increased demand for water meant that the pumping station was inadequate to supply the needs of all Portlanders. In addition, cholera was discovered in the water supply, resulting in several deaths. Despite the danger of cholera infection, the Borstal boys swam freely in the reservoirs, as seen in this picture of a swimming gala in the 1930s. Wells were dug all over Portland in a desperate search for fresh water. This picture shows a worker being lowered down an exploratory shaft in Southwell, just south of where Southwell Primary School once stood. This shaft went down 200 feet and then horizontally for over 170 feet. When capped and covered, it was used as a slide in Southwell Children's Playground. Everywhere that shafts were dug, water was found, but it was contaminated with sewerage and seawater. The solution was to build a new waterworks on the mainland at Friar Wadden between Upwey and Portisham, and this is where all Portland's water now comes from. Standing on the eastern cliff tops, the track of the dismantled railway can be seen. I was on the very last train that ran from Weymouth to Portland and back in 1965. Beyond the track there are two depressions in the stony beach. These were salt pans. The sea would fill these depressions at high tide, and the water would then evaporate as the tide receded to leave sea salt to be collected. There are stories that these salt pans may have been created by the Romans, but more likely they're medieval. It is possible to climb down to explore these salt pans, and several interesting items have been washed up there. I discovered this naval mine in the late 1980s. Luckily, it contained no explosive. At about the same time, I discovered a strange, unidentified Dead Sea creature. It had 2 long tusks and was about 15 feet long. I never discovered what this was, and it was destroyed by burning a few weeks after my discovery, so I was unable to research the carcass any further. This is the largest surviving lime kiln on Portland. It is within the grounds of the Youth Offenders Institution Farm, and it was built by prisoners around 1900. Lime kilns operated by burning chalk and coal in a tower, seen here on the left. This produced quicklime, which is calcium oxide. Quicklime can be used to spread on acidic agricultural land to make it more fertile. It can also be mixed with water to produce mortar for bricklaying. And according to Agatha Christie, sprinkling quicklime on a dead body before burial will cause the body to decay away without trace. Please note, this is not true, so don't try it. If you travel from the Portland Heights Hotel towards Easton Square, you will pass this building. It was a lime kiln. In the late 1980s, it looked like this. The renovation into a home has been excellent, and an interesting historic building has been saved. This shows the hearth where the quicklime was collected. Why am I showing an old picture of the Drury Lane Theatre? Well, quicklime was also used as a source of lighting. If a very hot flame is used to heat a lump of quicklime, an intense white light is produced. In theatres, before electric lighting was invented, the lighting was made from white-hot quicklime. This gave rise to the expression, "in the limelight," which when referring to actors on stage. All the quicklime used in the old Drury Lane Theatre came from this lime kiln just north of Easton. Several lime kilns have survived on Portland. This one is on private property, just opposite the Top Hill petrol station. This one is in a back garden in Avalanche Road. This one is at the back of the Youth Offenders Institute, photographed in 1989. Since then, a large fence has been built in front of it, and the whole area is now scrubland. Evidence for this lime kiln has now disappeared completely. What you see here is the ruined St Andrew's Church above Church Oak Cove, which is where Vikings landed for the first time on British soil. Built around the year 1100 on the site of a Saxon church, this old church was pillaged by French pirates in 1340 and again in 1404. It was much damaged also by multiple landslides and an earthquake, and was abandoned in the early 1700s. It is often referred to as the Pirates' Church because some tombs are adorned with the skull and crossbones. However, this was a common symbol on legitimate graves, and those buried in this churchyard were reputable members of Portland society. And now for a creepy story of a spooky candle I discovered in the 1990s. I was exploring in undergrowth behind a derelict wall when I found the large candle shown in this picture. I put my backpack beside it to show its size. I put this photograph on a website to try and find out more about the candle. I soon got a response, as shown on this next slide. That candle you discovered behind a wall at St Andrews, well, I myself also discovered the candle about 2 years ago. After a bit of research, mainly talking to old locals, it appears that the candle has been in use for one form or another for the last 20 years by a local coven during their black art ceremonies. The wax is actually human fat. Well, I thought that was pretty spooky and deserved more investigations. So I went back to have a look at the candle, but it was gone. Soon after, I was contacted by Sarah Curtis, the owner of Pennsylvania Castle at that time. She said that the candle was a garden decoration and it had been stolen. She was very pleased that it was safely back in her garden. There is some evidence for pagan rituals being conducted in this old graveyard. For example, in 1823, a ritual was performed of passing a child through the cleft of an ash tree as a cure for a hernia. Close by the old St Andrew's Church is a structure known as John Penn's Stone Bath. This was built in about 1805. When King George III, his wife and their large family visited Weymouth, they came for the sea bathing, which was considered to be extraordinarily healthy. John Penn, the owner of Pennsylvania Castle, decided that he too would engage in sea bathing, but he certainly wasn't going to climb all the way down to Church Oak Cove to do this. So he built a stone bath on the top of the cliff near his castle. The idea was that his servants would carry seawater up to the top of the cliff in buckets, and he would then bathe. John Penn was unaware that he'd built his stone bath on Crown land. The local court leet, who administered the estate of the Crown, watched and waited. When he had finished building his bath, they told him that he would have to pay 2 shillings and 6pence a year to use it, because he had encroached on the king's land. John Penn was outraged and refused to pay, so he never used the bath, much to the relief of his servants. The bath became derelict, but it can still be visited with care and is well worth the effort. At this point, I ask all gentlemen watching this video to close their eyes, because the next picture shows my partner Sandy in the bath. John Penn's stone bath, that is. I'm now going to move on and describe some of Portland's curious creatures. There have been reports of mermaids having been seen off Church Oak Cove, and these gave the now lost Mermaid Inn its name. Viesta is reputedly a large sea creature, part seahorse, part fish. This has been spotted swimming off Chesil Beach near Portland. The first documented report was in 1457. It was seen again by the historian Reverend John Hutchins in 1757, and seen again more recently in 1965. It's been depicted in stone, as seen here. A roundabout on the Weymouth Relief Road carries its name. Another sea monster was reported in the 15th century as follows. In the month of November 1457, in the Isle of Portland, not far from the town of Weymouth, was seen a cockerel coming out of the sea, having a great crest upon its head and a red beard and legs half a yard long. He stood on the water and crowed 4 times, and every time turned him about and beckoned with his head towards the north, towards the south, and then to the west, and was of a colour like a pheasant. And when he had crowed 3 times, he vanished away. Portland is home to a stupendous giant. He lives on the east side of Portland, overlooking the coastline, below the Youth Offenders Institute, and here he is. This giant head has inspired local author Carol Hunt to write a novel, one in her series, The Portland Chronicles. This large cave is about a mile north of Portland Bill. A local tale surrounds the cave that it is home to the Roy dog. This is a black dog as high as a man with large, fearsome eyes, one green, one red. It is said that the creature emerges from the watery depths to seize any traveller passing by Cave Hole, then drags them down into his dark, watery domain. This is similar to the description of another spectral Portland black dog with large saucer-shaped eyes, which prowls the island during the hours of darkness, called the Roe dog. The Roy dog has been immortalised by this sculpture by Damien Briggs in the Tout Quarry Sculpture Park. This fearsome animal has also inspired another Carol Hunt book. She has also written a fictional book about Portland pirates. That's the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope it inspires you to go to Portland and explore all its interesting places. Thank you.